Happy Days Part 2. Let's continue the subject of happy days. The 1950s, 60s, and 70s are often thought of as a time of peace and love, but let's not also forget that it was a time of war and hate. First of all, peace and love. Think about mass media of the time. Music and images we see from television, for example, Happy Days produced in the 70s, looking back at the 50s, and music that was heard on the radio, like the new rock and roll style of Elvis Presley and others. Very often the theme was upbeat, happy, peace, and love. This is also true if you think of the hippies of the 1960s. Woodstock, tie-dye t-shirts, flowers in their hair, and all. But let's not forget that the Cold War was going on at this time. Many Americans were living in fear as they built bomb shelters and school kids had drills, being told to get under their desks in the event of a nuclear attack. Like that would help. The interstate highway system was also built during this time. This was very much related to the Cold War. We think of interstates in terms of getting from one place to another, on the job or on a vacation. But they were actually built at this time in the name of defense, so that military supplies and troops could be transported quickly, and so that cities could be evacuated more quickly. The same is true of NASA. The many developments to come out of NASA were related to Cold War defense. The Vietnam War was also ongoing at this time. We've looked at some background information about the conflict in Vietnam. As our involvement grew in the conflict, so did frustration grow at home with growing protest movements, partly due to the nature of guerrilla warfare, the difficulty of knowing the enemy, and some highly publicized events where U.S. troops killed innocent civilians in Vietnam. Many Americans became more and more outspoken about our involvement in Vietnam. Some protested by picketing and chanting things like, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today?" accusing the president of sacrificing American youth without justification. Others protested by draft dodging, sometimes running away to Canada to escape the draft. There were also protests on many American college campuses at this time, the most famous being Kent State in Ohio. At the Kent State protests, some students were actually killed as the guard tried to disperse the crowd. This resulted in creating even more protests across college campuses, not only protesting the Vietnam War, but also the way in which the Kent State protest had been handled. One example of such a protest was at the University of Kentucky, which is fairly close to home. In response to this protest, America increasingly practiced the policy of Vietnamization, where we gradually transferred responsibility for defending South Vietnam over to the South Vietnamese themselves. The American government was not willing to immediately withdraw. That would be giving up and obviously losing the war. But by 1973, in the Nixon administration, we had gradually transferred responsibility to the South Vietnamese and withdrew from Vietnam. By 1975, the result was clear. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to the communist North Vietnamese. We had lost our first war. Americans weren't used to losing wars. To this day, people often refer back to Vietnam as an example of foreign policy that we should take lessons from. But different people take very different lessons from it. For example, it's very common to compare the situation in Iraq to Vietnam. On the one hand, some people protested our involvement in Iraq just as they saw our involvement in Vietnam as unnecessary. But on the other hand, others pointed to what happened after we withdrew, perhaps prematurely, from Vietnam and argued that, unlike Vietnam, if we were to pull out of Iraq too quickly, the enemy would perhaps follow us home. I'll leave you to draw lessons from the example of Vietnam as you see appropriate. This was also a time of racism. We'll go into the civil rights movement in more detail in a later lesson, but keep in mind these contrasting things, peace and love, war and hate, whether it be the Cold War, Vietnam, or racism. Finally, let's take a closer look at the counterculture and ask ourselves, who are the beatniks and hippies? A counterculture, of course, is a subculture that counters or runs opposite to the culture at large. If we're talking about the 1950s, we're referring to the beatniks, and if we're talking about the 1960s and 70s, the counterculture was referred to as hippies. Who were they? Well, they weren't all the same thing. At one level, we can look at the counterculture as simply a fad, a fashion statement. The clothes they wore, the music they listened to. Speaking of the beatniks, you may have an image of Fonz from Happy Days, or Elvis even, with the leather jacket, the white t-shirt, the greased hair. But many of the beatniks were also making more of a social or political statement, criticizing the society in which they lived. There were authors, poets, artists who were characterized as beatniks. The hippies, of course, the level of being a fad or a fashion statement, being a hippie was about wearing tie-dye and bell-bottoms, having long hair, and so on. But as at a different level, ask yourself, what was the counterculture? To some, it meant advocating a new morality. If you remember in our study of the 1920s, we talked about the, quote, new morality idea, that things that previous generations had considered not okay were now acceptable. I think this is very similar to what occurred in this period. A new morality, talking of things like free love, use of drugs, as I like to say, LSD and STDs. Well, that doesn't mean that all of the hippies were drug users, but to some, that was part of their definition of being in the counterculture. A third idea would be the political definition of the counterculture. To some, being a part of the counterculture meant participating in the New Left, the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, being involved in the Vietnam War protest, or being involved in the Civil Rights Movement. So for different people, the counterculture meant different things. For some, it was simply a fashion statement. Notice sometimes that the counterculture gets to be so popular that it then becomes the dominant culture. For some, it meant drug use, the whole 9 yards. For some, it had more of a political meaning. Some members of the counterculture could protest either the Vietnam War or civil rights injustices, and perhaps never use drugs in their life. So it's complicated. We have to be careful when we refer to these counterculture groups, because it didn't mean the same thing to everyone. Finally, ask yourself the question, whatever happened to the happy days? Or did they ever really exist? Sometimes we tend to be nostalgic, but let's keep in mind that each generation has its own battles and its own blessings as well.